The dust of Crestfall, Texas, had a way of getting into everything. It was a fine, reddish powder that settled on window sills, coated the leaves of the cottonwoods, and worked its way into the seams of a person's soul. In the summer of 1878, the heat was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the town from dawn until long after the sun had bled out behind the western hills. Life was measured in sweat and shadow. For Ruth Hadley, it was measured in the quiet, rhythmic tasks that filled her days. She was 26 years old, a fact that settled in the Hadley house with the same quiet permanence as the dust. Her two younger sisters, Clara and May, were the bright, noisy flames of the family. Clara had hair the color of spun gold and a laugh that could coax a smile from the sourest storekeeper in town. May had eyes the color of a summer sky and a way of tilting her head that made young men forget their own names. They were spoken of in terms of beauty and spirit. Ruth was spoken of in terms of steadiness. That Ruth, the neighbor women would say, she's a treasure. So reliable. It was the same tone they used for a good milk cow or a sturdy mule. Useful, dependable, never truly seen. She was the one who mended the lace on Clara's best dress when it tore, the one who sat up with May through a fever, the one who knew exactly how much yeast to use for the lightest bread. Her hands, rarely idle, were competent and sure, whether she was pulling weeds from her vegetable garden or coaxing a perfect seam with her needle. They were not the delicate, soft hands of her sisters. They were the hands of a woman who worked. Her garden was her sanctuary. It was a patch of defiant green behind the house, fenced with weathered pickets. There, she coaxed life from the stubborn Texas soil. Tomatoes swelled red on the vine. Beans climbed their poles with quiet determination, and sturdy marigolds stood guard against pests. It was the one place where she was not Clara and May's sister, but simply Ruth, the one who made things grow. She would spend the last hour of daylight there, her back to the house, feeling the heat finally begin to recede, listening to the buzz of late-working bees. She had noticed the new ranch hand, of course. It was impossible not to in a town the size of Crestfall. His name was Eli Crane, and he had hired on with Mr. Thompson a few months back. He was a quiet man, not given to the boisterous talk of the other cowboys who came into town on a Saturday. He had dark hair that curled a little when it was damp with sweat, and a way of looking at things a horse's shod foot, a length of harness leather, the distant line of hills, as if he were trying to understand them from the inside out. Ruth had seen him at the general store, his movements deliberate as he chose his supplies. He did not waste words or motion. There was a solidness to him, a settled quality that was unusual in a man who drifted from one ranch to another. She had seen him, noted him in the same way she noted a hawk circling high overhead, a part of the landscape, distant and unconnected to her. So when he stopped at her garden gate one Tuesday evening, his hat in his hands, she did not at first believe he was there for her. She was on her knees, thinning out the carrots, the scent of damp earth rich in the air. The click of the latch made her look up. He stood there, framed by the aging wood, the setting sun catching the dust motes dancing around him. "Evening, Miss Hadley," he said. His voice was low and even. She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her apron. Her heart gave a strange, unfamiliar flutter. "Mr. Crane." He looked at her, his gaze direct. He was not looking past her toward the house where Clara's laughter was just then spilling from an open window. He was looking at her. "I was wondering," he began, then paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I have a small cabin over on the north edge of the Thompson property. I make my own supper. It's not much, but the biscuits usually turn out." Ruth waited. She was certain the next words would be an inquiry about Clara, or perhaps May. Men often used her as a convenient messenger. He took a shallow breath. "I was hoping you might join me for supper this Friday." The words hung in the quiet air between them. Ruth's mind worked to rearrange them into a shape that made sense. He had spoken to her, used her name, but the invitation was surely a mistake, a slip of the tongue. He meant Clara. Of course he meant Clara. She kept her eyes on her dusty hands, twisting a corner of her apron. Clara is hoping to attend the social on Friday, she said, offering him an easy way out. But I can ask May for you if you like. She looked up at him then, expecting to see relief or embarrassment on his face. Instead, she saw only a quiet steadiness. His gaze had not wavered. I wasn't asking for Miss Clara, he said, his voice gentle but firm. And I wasn't asking for Miss May. I was asking you, Ruth. He had used her given name. It sounded different in his mouth. Not plain, not sturdy, just a name. For a woman. A long silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets starting their evening song. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. She was not going to give voice to the hope that felt like a fragile bird beating its wings in her chest. Oh, she said at last. It was a small, breathless sound. He nodded, as if he understood everything she had not said. I'll come to the gate for you. Around sundown. He put his hat back on, gave her a small, respectful nod, and walked away, his stride long and even down the dusty track that led back toward the main road. Ruth stood motionless by the gate, her hand resting on the weathered wood where his had been. She watched until he was just a silhouette against the deepening twilight, and the road going out into the dark beyond it. Friday came with a weight of anticipation that felt foreign to Ruth. Clara and May chattered endlessly about the church social, about which boys might be there, about the new ribbons they had bought for their hair. Ruth moved through the preparations in a daze, her thoughts a world away, in a small cabin she had never seen. She told her mother she had a headache and would not be attending the social, a declaration met with a simple, understanding nod. Ruth's headaches were a known and accepted part of the family landscape. As the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose, she changed out of her work dress and into her best calico, a simple brown print that she had always thought made her look like a sparrow. She brushed her hair until it shone, pinning it up in its usual neat coil. She looked at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror in her room. It was the same face that looked back at her every day. Plain, steady, but tonight there was a light in her eyes she did not recognize. She was in the garden when he arrived, pretending to check on her beans. She heard the familiar click of the gate latch, and her heart leaped. He stood there, just as before. He had washed and changed. He wore a clean shirt, and his dark hair was still damp. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. She walked through the gate, closing it carefully behind her, and fell into step beside him. The walk to his cabin was quiet. The air was warm and smelled of dust and sweet clover. Ruth was intensely aware of the space between them, of the way his arm brushed against hers when the path narrowed. She was used to being part of a noisy flock of sisters, her own presence buffered and softened by their vibrant energy. To be walking alone with a man, in the quiet of the evening, felt both terrifying and wonderful. His cabin was small, as he had said. It was built of rough-hewn pine, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. But inside it was impeccably clean. The single room held a narrow bed, covered with a wool blanket, a small stove, and a simple pine table. On the table were 2 chairs, 2 tin plates, and in the center, a mason jar filled with a haphazard collection of wildflowers. Purple verbena and yellow prairie daisies, their stems cut to slightly uneven lengths. He had cut them himself. That small, simple fact lodged itself in Ruth's heart. "It's not much," he said, gesturing to the room. His voice held a note of apology. "It's very nice," she said, and she meant it. The room felt like him. Orderly, unadorned, sincere. He gestured for her to sit, and she took one of the 2 chairs. He moved to the stove, a little awkward in the small space. "I'm afraid I let the pork go a minute too long," he confessed, lifting a skillet. The scent of slightly scorched meat filled the air. But the biscuits, they turned out. He served her a plate. The pork was indeed a little black around the edges, but the biscuits were golden brown and impossibly light. There were canned beans, heated through, and a jar of tart apple butter that he said his mother had sent him. They ate in a comfortable quiet at first. He did not seem to feel the need to fill the silence with chatter, and for that, Ruth was grateful. Then he started asking her questions. Not the polite, meaningless questions people asked at socials. He asked about her garden. He wanted to know which beans grew best in the heat, how she kept the squash bugs away, if she had any luck with late-season corn. He listened to her answers, his eyes on her face, nodding as she explained her system of planting marigolds among the tomatoes. She found herself talking more than she had in years. She told him about her grandfather's garden in East Texas, how he had taught her to read the soil and the sky. She spoke of the simple satisfaction of watching a seed sprout and grow into something that could feed a family. He understood. He spoke of the land in the same way, with a deep and abiding respect. He talked about the way a man could learn the temperament of a horse just by the way it held its head, the way a shift in the wind could tell you if rain was coming. When the meal was over, he poured them both coffee in tin mugs. It was strong and black. The pork had been burned, the plates were tin, and the cabin was tiny, but Ruth could not remember a finer meal. It was a meal made for her. A table set for her. A man who listened to her. The walk home was different. The silence was no longer heavy with questions, but filled with a quiet understanding. When they reached her gate, he stopped. The moon was high now, casting long shadows. "Thank you for coming, Ruth," he said. "Thank you for the supper, Eli," she replied, using his name for the first time. He simply nodded, and then he was gone. The following Friday, he was at the gate again. And the Friday after that. It became their ritual. He would come to the garden gate, never the front door. It was a quiet acknowledgement that this was between the two of them, separate from the bright, loud world of her sisters. Clara and May were bewildered. "He's so quiet," Clara said one afternoon, watching from the window as Eli mended a loose board on the Hadleys' porch steps, a task he had undertaken without being asked. "And he never laughs," May added, pouting slightly. "What do you even talk about?" Ruth just smiled. "We talk about the garden." It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about the weather and the price of cattle and a new foal born on the Thompson ranch. And in the spaces between their words, something else was growing, something as tenacious and hopeful as one of her tomato vines. One afternoon, weeks into their weekly suppers, Ruth was weeding near the fence she shared with the Miller property. Old Mistress Miller had a riotous patch of zinnias growing wild along the fence line, a chaotic explosion of pink, orange, and red. Ruth paused in her work, admiring them. "My mother used to grow zinnias," she said aloud, though only to herself. She said they were the most cheerful flowers God ever made. She did not know that Eli was walking the fence line on the far side of the pasture, checking for breaks. He was too far away for her to see clearly, but he heard her voice, a soft murmur on the breeze. He stopped, watching her for a moment as she reached out and gently touched one of the bright pink blossoms. Then he continued on his way. The next Friday, when he came to the gate, he was holding something in his hand. It was a small bundle of zinnia cuttings, their stems wrapped in a piece of damp calico to keep them fresh. He held them out to her. "I heard you say you liked them," he said simply. "Mistress Miller said I could take a few. She said they root easy enough in a jar of water." Ruth took the cuttings from him. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt went through her, warm and startling. She stared at the bright, cheerful flowers in her hand. He had heard her. He had been 100 yards away, a passing figure in the landscape, But he had heard her small, wistful comment, and he had remembered, and he had acted. It was more than a bouquet of flowers. It was a sign, a testament. It was proof that she was not invisible. Not to him. Tears pricked her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered. "No one has ever. Thank you." He just gave her that small, steady nod. "They're cheerful flowers," he said, echoing her own words back to her. From that day on, a row of zinnias grew along her garden fence, brighter and more vibrant than any other flower she had ever planted. The town of Crestfall began to notice. At first, it was just idle gossip at the general store. Saw the Thompson hand walking with the plain Hadley girl again. But as the weeks turned into a season, the talk shifted. The walks and the Friday suppers became an established fact. Eli Crane was courting Ruth Hadley. It was a curiosity, a puzzle the townspeople turned over in their minds. He was a good man, hardworking and respectable. He could have had his pick of any number of younger, prettier girls. Girls like Clara or May. Yet he chose Ruth. The culmination of this public curiosity came on a hot Saturday in late September. The whole county had turned out for a barn raising at the McClure Ranch. It was a day of communal labor and shared food, a cornerstone of life on the frontier. Men hammered and sawed under the hot sun, while women laid out long tables of fried chicken, potato salad, and pies. Ruth was helping serve lemonade when Eli came to stand beside her. He did not say anything, just took the cup she offered with a quiet, "Thank you," but his presence next to her was a statement. They stood there for a moment, watching the frame of the new barn rise against the blue sky, a comfortable silence between them. It was then that Jebediah McClure chose to make his presence known. McClure was a big man with a booming voice and an opinion on everything. He owned the largest ranch in the county and considered himself an authority on cattle, weather, and men. He strode over, clapping Eli hard on the shoulder, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Crane," he boomed. "Good to see you taking a break. I see you've got your eye on a Hadley girl." He winked, a fleshy, conspiratorial gesture. "Smart man, picking the plain one. A man starting out needs a worker more than a beauty, I always say. A good, sturdy woman to help build a homestead. That's the practical choice." A cold wave washed over Ruth. It was every unspoken fear she had ever harbored, every quiet insult she had ever imagined, spoken aloud for the whole world to hear. Plain, sturdy, a practical choice, a worker, a mule. The blood drained from her face, and she felt a dizzying sense of humiliation. She stared down at the wooden table, unable to look at anyone. She expected Eli to stammer, to be embarrassed, to pull away from her and laugh it off with McClure. She braced herself for the familiar sting of being overlooked, of being nothing more than a useful object. But Eli did not move. He did not laugh. He got very still. He slowly turned his head to look at McClure. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the surrounding chatter like a sharp knife. It was quiet, level, and deadly serious. "I came courting Ruth before I ever knew if she could boil water, McClure," he said, his eyes locked on the bigger man's face. A hush fell over the small crowd that had gathered. Eli went on, his voice unwavering. "And I'd come just the same if she couldn't. A man starting out needs a good woman by his side. Her heart and her character are what matter. The rest is just window dressing." He paused, letting the words settle in the thick, hot air. "And you'd do well to remember that Ruth Hadley has more character in her little finger than you have in your whole body." Then, he did something that sealed the moment in the town's memory forever. He turned his back completely on the stunned and reddening Jebediah McClure. He looked directly at Ruth, his eyes soft and full of a fierce protectiveness she had never seen before. He held out his arm to her. "Shall we get another glass of lemonade, Ruth?" he asked, as if they were the only two people there. She looked from his steady, waiting eyes to his offered arm. The buzzing in her ears subsided, replaced by the strong, even beat of her own heart. She put her hand on his arm. It felt solid. It felt like home. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'd like that." As they walked away, leaving McClure speechless in their wake, a murmur went through the crowd. It was a sound of respect, of understanding. The women looked at Ruth with new eyes. The men looked at Eli with a deep, knowing approval. And in that moment, the whole town of Crestfall knew it. This was not a practical choice. This was a man who had chosen his woman, and he would stand by her against anyone. What country are you listening from? It's a wonder to me how far these stories can travel, from a dusty corner of Texas to wherever you are now. Drop it in the comments below. I'm always grateful to see where we're sharing this time together. Now, let's get back to Ruth and Eli. The rest of the afternoon passed in a dream for Ruth. The sting of McClure's words faded, replaced by the warm, solid feel of Eli's arm linked with hers. He did not let her go. They walked among the tables, they spoke with neighbors, and all the while, his presence was a shield and a declaration. He was not just courting her, he was claiming her. That evening, for the first time, he did not come to the garden gate. As the last light faded, there was a firm knock on the Hadleys' front door. Clara, thinking it was one of her own suitors, rushed to open it, then stopped in surprise. It was Eli Crane. He held his hat in his hands, but he stood tall and straight on the porch. "Good evening, Miss Clara," he said politely. "I've come to speak with your father." "Is he at home?" Mr. Hadley, drawn by the formal tone, came into the hall. He looked from Eli's determined face to Ruth, who had appeared silently in the doorway behind him. A slow smile spread across her father's face. He had seen what had happened at the barn raising. The whole town had. "Come in, son," he said, clapping Eli on the shoulder. "Come right in." They spoke in the parlor for half an hour. Ruth waited in the kitchen, her hands twisting in her apron, her sisters fluttering around her with 1,000 excited questions. When the parlor door opened, Eli came out first. He walked directly to her. "He said yes," Eli said, his voice low and for her alone. "But it's you who has to answer, Ruth. I would like to build a life with you, to build a home. If you'll have me." He was not asking her to be a worker. He was asking her to be his partner, his wife, the center of his home. She looked up into his earnest, steady eyes, and the fragile bird of hope in her chest soared. "Yes, Eli," she said. "Obviously, yes." Their courtship was a brief and happy time. There were Sunday walks where they planned the house he would build on the piece of land he had already bought with his savings. There were shared meals at the Hadley table, where Eli's quiet presence seemed to anchor the family's noisy energy. He spoke with her father about crop rotation and with her mother about the best way to preserve peaches. He even managed to win over Clara and May, who finally saw in his quiet devotion a romance more powerful than all the flirtatious banter of their own beaux. Their wedding, 2 months later, was a simple affair. The small church in Crestfall was filled not with grand decorations, but with the genuine warmth of their friends and neighbors. Ruth wore a dress of plain ivory wool, sewn with her own neat, perfect stitches. She did not feel plain in it. She felt cherished. As she stood beside Eli at the altar, his hand holding hers, she felt the rightness of it all. This solid, quiet man had seen her when she was invisible. He had heard her when she was silent. He had valued her when the world saw only her use. After the ceremony, they returned to his cabin. It was still small, but now it felt different. It felt like the beginning of everything. That night, for their wedding supper, he made the meal. He managed not to burn the pork, but before he lifted his own fork, he paused. He looked at her, seated across the small table where the jar of wildflowers always sat. "Please," he said, You first." From that evening on, no supper at his table ever began until she sat down and was served first. It was his unspoken rule, a quiet daily reminder of his public declaration. She was not the help. She was the heart of his home. 5 years passed. The fine reddish dust of Crestfall still settled on everything, but now it settled on the porch of a small, sturdy house that Eli had built with his own hands. The house stood on 100 acres of land that was now theirs, the soil turned and tended with care. Along the front of the house, a riot of zinnias bloomed in a dozen shades of pink, red, and orange, a testament to a quiet promise made long ago. One evening in late summer, Ruth sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a mending basket in her lap. Eli sat in a matching chair beside her, cleaning a piece of harness leather, the scent of oil and old leather mingling with the sweet smell of the flowers. The silence between them was as comfortable and deep as a well. A small boy with his father's dark, serious eyes and quiet way sat on the porch steps, carefully trying to carve a piece of soft wood with a dulled knife. Inside the house, a little girl with her mother's steady hands and a halo of blonde hair hummed to herself as she set 2 small dolls at a makeshift table. Eli finished his work, setting the harness aside. He looked at his son, then at his wife. A slow, contented smile touched his lips. "He's got your focus," Ruth said quietly, nodding toward their son. "He has your patience," Eli replied, his eyes meeting hers over the fading light. "He'll be a good man." Ruth picked up a shirt from her basket. It was Eli's, a small tear near the cuff. As she threaded her needle, she remembered the hundreds of shirts she had mended for her father, her brothers-in-law, for everyone but herself. This was different. This was an act not of duty, but of love. She looked over at him. "Do you remember that first supper you made for me?" she asked, a smile playing on her lips. "You burned the pork." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "I remember. I was so nervous my hands were shaking. I'm surprised the biscuits didn't come out hard as rocks." "The biscuits were perfect," she said softly. Everything was perfect. He reached over and took her hand, the one that wasn't holding the needle. His fingers were calloused and strong around hers. He looked out at the land they had built together, at the house that was a home, at the family that was their world. He looked at the woman beside him, the quiet, steady center of it all. He had been a man adrift, looking for a place to anchor. He had found it at a garden gate, in the eyes of a woman who thought she was invisible. That is the thing about being truly seen. It is not about grand gestures or loud declarations, not really. It is about the quiet attention of someone who bothers to learn the shape of your soul. It is about the person who hears the wish you whisper only to yourself, who remembers the flower you love, who sees the queen in you when all you feel is the plain brown sparrow. Love, in its purest form, is a long and patient observation. It is the steady gaze that says, without a word, "I see you. You are here, and you are everything." Thank you for riding with me today. It's a privilege to share these stories with you, and I am grateful you were here. Until next time, keep writing.